Yes, would you ask Mr. Cash to come back in, please? Right, Mr. Cash, ready to carry on?
I am indeed, yes.
Good, thank you. Yes, Mr. Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Cash, I'd like to turn now to the topic of the decision to re-tender in 2013. Now, just by way of background, it's right, I think, that in late 2012 and early 2013, Chui Chen Lim produced a number of budget cost estimates for the refurbishment, didn't she?
Correct.
Yes. And just in brief, would you agree that a budget cost estimate is a pre-tender report on costs so that the client can compare them with the contractor's tenders?
Yes, they vary in detail as the design develops through that stage, yes.
Yes. And you monitored and supervised Ms. Lim's cost analysis process, I think, as you told us before.
Correct.
Yeah. Now, I just want to look at some documents showing the Artelia cost analysis as against the TMO's budget. We know from the documents that Ms. Lim did, I think, several cost estimates. Can you confirm, what we know from the documents already, that from stage D onwards, every cost estimate that Ms. Lim prepared was over the TMO's eventual budget of 8.415 million for construction?
Correct.
Yes. That's 8.415 million. Just an example of that, to see it in the documents, we can see ART 406140. This is the Stage D report, which Artelia prepared on costs of December 2012 for the TMO. You can see that on page 1. And from page 3, if you look at the second to last paragraph, Stage D costs have now been developed in parallel with the latest design to give an estimated total construction cost of £8.415 million, excluding VAT, including contingency at 10%, but excluding fees, and an estimated overall project cost of £9.645 million, excluding VAT. Can you confirm that the Artelia estimates after that did not reduce to a figure less than £8.5 million odd?
I think that's correct, yes.
Given that, did you ever think to yourself that the TMO could not afford this project, given the discrepancy with the TMO's budget that you had?
Yes, in terms of the funding that they had identified as being available at the time, yes.
Did it ever occur to you that they couldn't afford this project? In other words, their budget was too low for construction costs and fees?
Not that their budget was too low, that their expectations were too high.
Right. That may be the same thing, depending on whether the coin lands tails up or heads up.
It is, but in reality, you start with is what you have in your pocket, and what we normally find is that clients' expectations in terms of what they try to achieve for the money that they have to afford is normally in excess of their in terms of it's in excess of what they can afford. Therefore,
I follow.
It has to be managed.
I follow. I think we have your evidence on that. Can I then turn to the Leadbitter costs? Now, in early 2013, Ms. Lim engaged with Mr. Katecha of Leadbitter, didn't she?
Yes.
And that was specifically on the subject of Leadbitter's cost budget for the refurbishment. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Yeah. And Leadbitter's budgets were consistently higher than Artelia's, weren't they?
Yes.
If we look at your first witness statement at page 30, please, we'd look at paragraph 96 and 97. I'd like you to read those in full. Well, I'll show them to you in full. 96, you say, the TMO is concerned about the gap between Leadbitter's costs and its budget as seen in Paul Dunkerton's emails to Alan Dawson on the 15th of March 2013. In Alan's response to Paul Dunkerton, he noted Leadbitter's continued failure to engage with the questions asked of it as follows, and then he sets out the text of that. As discussed when we met, the level of detail being provided by Leadbitter is very lean, even acknowledging that it's based on Stage D information. See attached by way of example. We've repeatedly asked for more detailed breakdowns, which Leadbitter have not provided. This makes it very difficult for us to make proper comparisons. We hope, therefore, that the proposed face-to-face meetings with Leadbitter and their supply chain will allow us to interrogate their figures/allowances in more detail, and so help unblock this current impasse, and thus put us in a position to give you clearer advice on the matter. And then it continues. Alan continued to press Leadbitter for better information, as seen in his emails between the 15th and 20th of 2013. However, Leadbitter continued to be unresponsive, despite Peter Madison making his frustration clear to Colin Chiles in his email on 20th of March 2013. Alan also reiterated his concerns to Colin Chiles on the 21st of March 2013. Now, you say in paragraph 97 there that Leadbitter continued to be unresponsive. Did you mean that they just didn't communicate at all?
I think that was the implication, yes.
Yeah. I mean, they wouldn't break down their costs into segments. Is that fair?
Correct.
And they didn't agree, certainly, with Artelia's costs.
Correct.
Is there anything else that they failed to do by way of communication?
I can't remember if there were any other specifics.
Right. Miss Lim, who had done the detailed analysis of Leadbitter's costs, says in her evidence that she felt that Leadbitter had not provided adequate detail or support for its figures. Were you of that mind at the time?
Yes.
And she also says that she wasn't convinced by what Leadbitter was saying and found their lump sum approach suspicious. And that's her witness statement, ART 405817 at page 15, paragraph 53. Again, were you of that mind at the time as well?
I wouldn't say that I was suspicious. I was just concerned that they weren't giving sufficient detail to allow us to interrogate their figures to find out what was actually contained within their budget estimates.
Very well. Now, we've seen that paragraphs 96 and 97 of your statement that you've given a sort of recitation of the record shown by those emails. Can we go to an email from Ms. Lim to Mr. Dawson at ART 406095. This is at 21st of January 2013, and she says, "Hi, Alan, unfortunately there's no breakdown provided by them, just a lump sum figure." And she goes on to say, "It's difficult to take a view at this stage as they didn't provide any rates." And she makes some comments. Would providing would it be enough in principle for Leadbitter to provide a lump sum figure and no rates?
It wouldn't allow us to do a reasonable comparison to understand where the differences were between our figures and theirs.
And that's why you'd want a breakdown, presumably?
Correct.
And rates, I see. Were you personally looking for any of the detail of Leadbitter's figures during this period? This is January 13 through to April 13.
Yes.
You were. Did you think Leadbitter should have provided more detailed breakdown and rates?
Yes, I do.
Did your view of Leadbitter during this period, from January 13 onwards, become any more positive, or did it stay the same, that they remained unresponsive?
It remained the same, despite requests for them to provide further information.
Right. Well, let's look at Mr. Katecha's side of the story. He was lead project surveyor for Leadbitter, and I'd like just to show you what he says in his witness statement. This is LBI 403938 at page 2. And he says there at page 2, paragraph 7, due to the limited design information provided by the client's professional team and the high-level nature of the specifications issued by the TMO and all their professional team throughout the tender process, my knowledge and involvement in the Grenfell Tower refurbishment project was limited to carrying out a basic feasibility study rather than the provision of detailed proposals. In this regard, I worked with the set of tender documents provided by the client's consultant team in order to develop the basic cost plan issued by Appleyards into an elemental market-tested cost plan, which is a more detailed review of the cost in a package-by-package breakdown, which highlight the allowances for each construction package. Now, he's criticising the design information provided by the Grenfell professional team as limited and high level. Would you agree with Mr. Katecha's assessment that the designs and specifications that Leadbitter received were limited and high level?
No, I wouldn't agree with that on the basis that they were reaching stage D, which is a technical level.
Right. Can we look at Colin Chiles' witness statement? He's another gentleman mentioned by you in the context of this exchange or period. This is LBI 403936, please, at page 5, paragraph 5. Sorry, I want to show you paragraphs 17 and 18 on that page, page 5. Under the heading Cost Proposals and Submissions Made by Leadbitter, he says, as a general comment, given the underdeveloped nature of the client specification and design, Leadbitter was not in a position to put forward firm pricing proposals. Nevertheless, we continued to provide budget advice and began to review buildability issues. The design was in an undeveloped state, and whilst areas of the design developed in a good way, for example, internals on the lower floors, the brief remained fluid, with elements being added, removed, or adjusted in various areas of the tower. Certain areas of the design were subject to redesign for budgetary reasons, and consequently the Leadbitter team had to carry out repeat costing exercises. And at 18, he says this: the design was far from sufficient to provide detailed prices, and our commercial team had to take robust views of budget costs to ensure a deliverable budget could be achieved with the advice of supply chain members where necessary. The headline figure in our initial budget was substantially above the cost plan sum provided by Appleyards. Alternative materials to adjust budgets were proposed by the client's design team. However, as the design was underdeveloped, this did not permit substantial movement of the budget costs. That's what he says. Picking out what he says there as the design in an undeveloped state and fluid, was it your view that the design was sufficiently detailed for a contractor to be able to provide a cost breakdown which the TMO and Artelia sought?
Of the level of detail that we were looking for supporting information that sat behind the lump sum figures. We weren't looking for a firm pricing proposal.
I see. Do you accept that the design was underdeveloped and fluid, such that it was justifiably difficult for Leadbitter to provide detailed prices?
No, I don't. I think that there was sufficient detail within the information that had been provided. There were elements that were still fluid in terms of final decisions, but the principles of design were still there.
Right. Can you account for why it is that both of these individuals from Leadbitter, Mr. Katecha and Mr. Chiles, were of this view, that the design was undeveloped and fluid, and insufficient information was available to them to be able to provide a detailed breakdown of the costs?
I don't know why they say that.
You can't account for it. Right. Well, let me just try and give you some examples. I mean, do you remember, we can go to documents if you need it, but let me just suggest them. Leadbitter had suggested value engineering on cladding, stairs, and reduced insulation. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And they'd suggested savings on cladding of £300,000, in fact, hadn't they?
Yes.
Do you remember that?
Yes.
And also, I think there was a suggestion from Andrew McQuat of Max Fordham in February of 2013 about alternative boilers. Do you remember that?
Vaguely, yes.
So even at this stage, is it right that, in fact, Leadbitter, although they couldn't provide the breakdown, were nonetheless suggesting ways of making the budget, or reducing their budget by way of value engineering?
Correct, but that was in respect of potential changes, not in respect of the design that had been carried out to that point in time.
Yes, I follow. Now, excuse me. As part of the cost analysis work, I think we know that Artelia sought to check the prices of other contractors. You remember that?
Yes.
Can we look at ART 409136, please? This is an internal Artelia email of March 2013, and you're copied in on all of the emails in this string. It runs over a number of pages. If we can just look at the top one, it's from Alan Dawson to Robert Powell, and you're copied in on it, 22nd of March 2013. And he says to Robert Powell, Tweetchen has now advised that Waits and Wilmot Dixon have come back with the two best performance ratings from our database. So I'd suggest that they're the two we need to talk to for the purpose of this high-level cost check exercise. In terms of the time frame, this will largely depend on when we're next meeting with the client, which is yet to be resolved, pending Leadbitter's availability, but I thought we should aim to have the costs back for the end of next week, latest. Now, the reference there to a high-level costs check exercise, do you remember that topic being discussed?
Yes, I do.
Do you know why a high-level costs check was done?
To try and provide a check against the cost estimate that we had prepared and against the figures that Leadbitter were submitting, to see if see where a market test might put to effectively another opinion of what the job might cost.
Right. Is this something that happens on other projects?
Yes, it is.
Such projects generally, it is it?
Yes.
Now, let's go to ART 409101. Because we can scroll forward in time to the 23rd of April 2013 to this document, Mr. Cash. This is a status report of April 2013 produced by Appleyards.
Correct.
Now, Do you remember that this was issued to Paul Dunkerton of the TMO and signed off by Robert Powell of Appleyards, as it then was?
I remember it being issued,
Right.
but I can't remember it specifically being issued to Paul Dunkerton.
All right. Well, when it was issued, do you think that you read it or approved it in any way before it was sent out?
I was aware of the contents of it, yes.
Right. Did you have any personal input into it?
It was prepared by Robert Powell, and then I would have reviewed it.
Right. I see. So if we look at page 18 in this document, under paragraph 5, procurement principal contractor, and picking this up at the third paragraph down, it says, given the present issues surrounding the project and acknowledging that the cause of at least some of the delays and inability to reconciliate, as it's put, the cost plans between Appleyards as PQS and Leadbitter have been suggested due to a lack of responsiveness and proactiveness on Leadbitter's part, it has been suggested that the TMO might be best suited to procure an alternative principal contractor for the project. You see that? And then in the next paragraph, it says, it's currently being considered that an alternative framework might give the TMO access to other contractors capable of better delivering the GTRP project. And then 5 paragraphs down on the same page, it says that to date the LHC framework has been identified as a possible solution, and a number of contractors available on this framework have been requested to provide a check price against Leadbitter based on a short scope of work and drawings provided to them. And then there are 4 entities set out: Waits, Wilmot Dixon, Higgins Contracts, and Lake House. Just can you help us? The LHC framework, what is that?
It is a framework that has been through a pre-selection process to identify contractors for a particular for particular works.
Right. Now, RBKC were part of the LHC framework, Southern England region, I think, weren't they?
I believe so, yes.
Does that mean that they could procure works from each of those LHC contractors listed
Yes.
in the bullet points?
Yes.
Yes. So, just to explain for everyone's benefit, that meant, didn't it, that the TMO could appoint them without a competitive tender?
I'm not sure what the terms of the LHC framework are specifically as to whether they'd be required to go through what is termed mini-tender process or whether they could be appointed direct.
I see, but whether it's one or the other of those, it wouldn't be a full-blown OJEU-style tender.
Correct.
Right. Now, do you remember that none of those contractors, Waits, Wilmot Dixon, Higgins, or Lake House, returned check price estimates in the end, did they?
No, they didn't.
No. And LHC, does that stand for London Housing Consortium?
Yes.
It does. Ryden, I think, was also asked to provide a market check, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
We can see that from the next document I want to show you. That's ART 409105, please. That's an email run in April 2013. Page 4 takes us to the email of the 5th of April from Robert Powell to Steve Blake. You see that?
Yes.
And it starts. Oops. Yes, that's it. We can keep on that one. There are a number of emails, but that's the email to look at. And he says to Steve Blake in the second paragraph, perhaps you would look at the attached supporting information for the proposed redevelopment of Grenfell Tower, RBKC. If you would be prepared to venture a check price against this, it would help us, recognising that we need to agree a usable framework / means of procurement with RBKC. As mentioned, we are talking to more than one contractor in consideration of such an appointment, and our client is looking to utilise their existing frameworks to procure same. Did Artelia have an existing relationship with Ryden?
No.
Do you know who put Robert Powell in touch with Steve Blake at Ryden?
No.
Was it Peter Madison, possibly?
I don't know.
You don't know. Right. Can we then look at ART 408434? This is a little earlier in time. Yes, and it's 8th of March 2013 email run about the costs check. And on the 8th of March, you can see that Alan Dawson writes to you and Treach and Lim saying, Simon Treacher, as I thought, Rydent aren't on either framework, please see below. So whilst I've already spoken to them this afternoon and await a call back on Monday, I'm not sure that they could be used moving forwards. You see that?
Yes.
And then you come back by way of response about an hour later and say, Alan, my view is that you explain the situation to Rydent and see if they're still happy to assist. They may say yes as a means of developing a relationship with Appleyards. Now, we can see that you've been involved in a discussion about a month before about approaching Rydent to quote. So at this time, Rydent weren't part of any framework involving the TMO, were they?
They weren't involved in either of the particular frameworks that were under consideration.
No. Would that mean, or did that mean at the time, that the TMO wouldn't be able to appoint Rydent directly to the project or off one of the frameworks? It meant that Rydent would have to compete in an open competition and win it.
Unless there was another framework that the TMO could procure through that Rydent were actually part of.
Indeed, but did you know of one?
I didn't.
No. And I don't think one was suggested, was it?
I don't believe so.
No. Now, just going back to the email to which you're responding, this is from Alan Dawson to you on the 8th of March. In his last sentence there, he says, any thoughts on this, as I'm a little reluctant to draw them in under false pretenses, and or do you have any preferences for AN other? Did you envisage at this time that Rydent might be appointed to the Grenfell project?
I had no intent, no vision that they may or may not be.
Right. So I think you wanted to be above board with Rydent and make it clear to them that they were only being asked to provide a price, but if they were going to come in, they would have to take part in an open tender.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah. At all events, I think it's right in the end that Rydent didn't actually provide a market price or market check price to Artelia at this time, did they?
I don't think they did, no.
Can we then turn to a different subtopic, which is RBKC's role in this? Can we go first to ART 50636, please? This is an email to you. Sorry, from you to an email address called 11833 Grenfell Tower. Subject, Grenfell Tower Regeneration Project, Leadbitter. And the text is addressed to Alan Dawson. Just help me, what's 11833 Grenfell Tower?
That's an internal email address which would distribute to myself, Alan Dawson, Treaten Lim, and Keith Bushell, and David Hale. So it was, rather than using individual internal email addresses, it was a group email address.
Yes, I see. I follow. And you say that you, Alan, you should also be aware of the email that Laura Johnson has sent to Leadbitter, which is more specific than Mark's and clearly states that they are recommending the TMO do not proceed with Leadbitter. And your email, as we can see, forwards an email from Laura Johnson of RBKC. It's a little bit below that, but do you remember that? Perhaps we should look at it. If you go to ART 50637, this is the email from RBKC. Do you see that? And it's dated the 3rd of January 2013, and that's what you forwarded to the Artelia team, yes?
Yes.
And it's addressed to Cliff Thomas at Leadbitter from Laura Johnson. And if you look at the third paragraph, it says there was originally a total of around £60 million available for the Calc project and Grenfell Tower. RBKC will now no longer be recommending the TMO proceeding with you on the latter and will advise them to re-tender the works to a list of contractors, not including Leadbitter. Now, just pausing there, is it right that in January 2013, you knew that RBKC did not want Leadbitter on the Grenfell project at all?
That was the implications from Laura, yes.
Yes. Do you know why RBKC did not want Leadbitter on the Grenfell Tower project at this time?
Because they'd had a lot of protracted negotiations in trying to get to financial close on the Calc project, and saw that in terms of Leadbitter not providing the information that had been requested in relation to the cost estimates, that they could see something similar happening again on the Grenfell Tower project.
Right. When you saw that email, did you take any action?
I can't remember if I did.
What struck you from that email? What was your reaction to it?
That RBKC had lost patience with Leadbitter, and didn't want to go through the same hoops again with the Grenfell Tower project. Right.
Given what RBKC had said in clear and firm terms, that they no longer want Leadbitter on the Grenfell Tower project, why did you and the TMO want still to see if you could negotiate Leadbitter down to a lower price?
I can't remember why we did that. I can't remember in terms of the context of this particular email between Laura and Cliff, what bearing that had in terms of instructions to the TMO,
right,
in taking Leadbitter forward.
How well known, to the best of your knowledge and understanding, looking back on it, how well known was RBKC's view about Leadbitter within the TMO itself?
I'm not sure.
Right. Did you ever have any discussion at this time with anyone at the TMO about RBKC's desire not to use Leadbitter on the Grenfell Tower project?
I can't remember. I don't believe so.
Right. You see, Artelia doesn't seem to have done anything in response to that email, but does investigate reprocurement in the February and March of 2013 and into the April, as we've seen. I've already shown you that. My question really is, given the fact that RBKC had said they don't want Leadbitter on the Grenfell Tower project, why did you continue to see if you could get Leadbitter down by way of examining their costs?
RBKC weren't our client in reference to the Grenfell Tower project.
So did you ignore what Laura Johnson was saying on the basis that, since she wasn't your client, it wasn't up to them?
Our client, the TMO, wanted us to carry on discussions with Leadbitter.
I follow. What we get, I think, from the documents at that time, the first quarter of 2013, is that Artelia was trying to bridge the gap between its own cost analysis and that of Leadbitter's, but at the same time, and perhaps separately, TMO is investigating reprocurement. Is that a fair summary of what was happening in those months?
Yes. When you say bridge the gap, what we were trying to do was understand why the gap, not necessarily bridge it.
I understand that. My poor choice of words. Understand the gap.
Yes.
But other than that correction, is that a fair summary of
yes.
the events at that time?
Correct.
Okay. Can we then turn to what then happened in the spring of 2013, leading to the decision to put the project on hold later that year? And we start, I think, with ART 409101. Now, this is the status report produced by Artelia in April 2013. Did you have any involvement in the production of this document?
Not in the production, only in the overview of it once it had been produced.
So did you approve it once it had been produced?
I'd say yes in terms of the loosest sense. I didn't say that I approve it, but I reviewed it and I didn't have any comment on it.
Very well. Okay. But before it went out, you were happy with it, were you?
Correct.
Right. Do you know who actually wrote it?
Robert Powell.
Robert Powell. Did he have any help, or did you do it himself?
I believe he did it himself.
Okay. Now, if we go to page 5, we find an executive summary, and we can see from the second paragraph in that that the report had been generated because the project had been extremely slow. And it says that the scheme was outside the parameters for time and cost. I'm summarising it, but that's a fair summary of the background, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. And in the middle of page 5, we can see a 7-bullet point list summary of the contributory factors to the present situation. In summary, it says the contributory factors to the present situation are, and I'll read them out to you. Client brief has been allowed to develop in a piecemeal fashion over time. Absence of a controlled and managed scope for the project. Late commitment to a defined construction budget. Historic relationships and contractual position regarding the associated CALC project may have frustrated good and proactive progress. Absence of earlier intervention, absence of proper change control applied to the design brief, and slow reaction of the proposed contractor to address and align cost plans. Do you agree that that list accurately summarised the state of the project as at April 2013?
Yes, I do.
Can we look at the bottom of page 8 then, and over to page 9? We can see some further factors there, which, some of which repeat previous points about what led the project to stall. It says at the bottom of page 8, however, at today's date, the project has effectively stalled, primarily due to the inability to align the cost plans of the contractor and the PQS, the difference being in excess of £1.2 million. Further, there is circumstantial evidence to suggest the following: that the scope of the project developed over time without clear guidance on budget from the client, early cost plans indicated affordability of the project, and scope creep due to an absence of clarity of a budget and design team inclusions of clients' requests for scope enhancement and perceived requirements from local authority planners. In addition to the foregoing, there have been several changes of personnel involved with the project in each of the client, professional and contractor teams, which may have contributed to the issues being faced by the project at today's date. Do you agree that those 3 bullet points were also contributing factors?
Yes, I do.
Right. Now let's look at page 9, a little lower down, the second paragraph I've just read to you, which says, in addition to the foregoing, several changes of personnel there. Can you just enlighten us as to what that meant, what was being referred to there?
There were changes along the route by, we had changes in terms of our own personnel because of people leaving the business and having to bring in new people. The TMO, Mark Anderson, when he started, was only in an interim role, and his role was then passed down to Paul Dunkerton, and I'm not sure if by this time Claire Williams was already on board, and that there were changes in personnel as well in terms of the Leadbitter team, in terms of who was dealing with aspects of the project as well.
Yes, I see. Who were the people leaving the business from Artelia's end?
It would have been Alan Dawson.
Ah, okay. When did he leave?
Sorry, when?
Yeah, just.
I can't remember
it's
the
in
exact.
his statement, I think.
I can't remember the exact dates, but it's obviously covered within his statement.
Right. We know that Claire Williams wasn't, in fact, involved in this project until the September of 2013. Okay. But we also know Peter Madison joined it in the January of that year.
Yes.
Is that one of the other one of the features or factors that's referred to here?
Yes, and again, another person who was introduced to the project, and again, I can't remember the exact dates, was David Gibson as well.
I follow. So, flux within the client team, in a nutshell.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, I just put to you that Peter Madison became involved with this project in the January of 2013. Do you remember that? It's a matter of record,
remember.
But do you remember it?
I can't remember specifically, but yes, I know that he became involved. Yes.
Right. Did you notice any particular change in attitude from TMO once he became involved?
Not that I can remember.
Right. There's also a reference to changes in each of the professional and contractor teams. What was that a reference to? Do you know?
I believe that it would have been a reference to, I suppose, like ourselves, a change in personnel, who were people who had left the business and had been replaced, or people who had been moved between projects.
Right. Who specifically? Can you give us any
I can't remember.
Names, dates? No? Right.
No.
Then let's look at page 18. At the bottom of this page, you'll see a numbered list. And this is a list of, well, it says, whilst this exercise is underway, Appleyards would suggest that this is not a viable option for the following reasons. And this is a retender, essentially. One, and I'll show you the list. One, PQS project costs maintain that the overall cost of the scheme is in excess of the budget, which would indicate a more fundamental action is required rather than to just change the contractor. Two, usurping Leadbitter at this stage throws up legal questions about the TMO's ability to do this. Appleyards are unable to comment on the legalities of this and recommend separate legal advice is sought if this were to remain an option. 3, replacing the principal contractor at this stage will incur additional time and expense without the guarantee that the TMO would be any better served by the replacement. And 4, Leadbitter's knowledge of the overall scheme, the client and the project team is lost. And then over the page to 9, it says, accordingly, and given the recommendations elsewhere in this report, if we just flip to page 9, top of page 19, I'm so sorry. Accordingly, and given the recommendations elsewhere in this report, Appleyards recommend retaining Leadbitters as preferred contractor for the scheme in whatever form it is finalised. Now, PQS there, is that a reference to Project Quantity Surveyor?
Yes.
That's Miss Lim, isn't it?
Correct.
Under your supervision.
Yes.
And now, before I ask you further about this, can I also show you page 25 of the same document? Here we see Artelia's conclusions and recommendations. And in the second paragraph down, it says to revise the scope of the project. I'm so sorry, I'm looking at the wrong paragraph. I'm going to come back to that one very shortly. Before I do, it's a little higher up the page. It's the second main paragraph under conclusions and recommendations. I'll come to that list later. But it says the project is currently over budget with little expectation that if left to iterative reviews with the contractor, giving diminishing returns, that costs will be aligned or reduced sufficiently to make the scheme affordable. And in the next paragraph, it says the TMO has advised that it has desires to change the overall scheme to accommodate a change in brief, and the proposed VE options, value engineering options, to afford these proposed changes may be consumed simply to bring the existing scheme within the realms of affordability. And then if we look at the third paragraph from the bottom, on page 25, it goes on to say, accordingly, it is Appleyard's opinion that unless the project in its current guise is stopped and a fundamental review embarked upon to redefine the scope, programme and cost, it will fail. So, bearing in mind those sections of the report I have read to you, is it fair to summarise Artelia's recommendations as being, don't replace Leadbitter as the main contractor, one, yes?
Yes.
And secondly, do have a fundamental review of the scope of the project to redefine the scope, programme and cost?
Correct.
Yes. And if you look at the recommendations at the bottom of page 25 now, it says, according to our recommendation, to stop the scheme in its existing guise immediately, pending a design team review. 2, to revise the scope of the project, including the decent homes requirements within the 8.5 million budget in mind and issue formally. 3, revise the project programme. And there are other things too. So those are Artelia's recommendations. In essence, is this right, Mr. Cash? The real problem here was that the TMO simply couldn't afford the project as designed within the existing budget.
Correct.
We then move on in time. That's the status report well, let me suggest to you, extremely clear terms in April 2013.
Yes.
Yes. I mean, I suppose this is an Aunt Sally question, but were you in any doubt when you saw this document about what it was that Artelia was telling your client?
No doubt at all.
No. Then let's go to ART 406252, please. This is an email of the 21st of May 2013, a month later, from Robert Powell to Philip Booth about a meeting with the TMO, and you're copied in. And it says, Philip, interesting meeting this AM. Basically, Peter Madison has been overruled by Laura Johnson. She wants to keep the works for the boxing club and nursery and doesn't want to progress the kitchens and bathrooms at this stage necessarily. Also, PM, Peter Madison, not keen on progressing with Leadbitter. Our report kicking this all off was based upon the objective of preserving the programme. This now not so important, value for money is. Accordingly, we are likely to reprocure scheme via OJEU. Now, just looking at that, Laura is Laura Johnson, is it?
Correct.
Presumably. And then it goes on. Now, it looks as if you attended this meeting. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
You were right. When Robert Powell used the words overruled, Peter Madison has been overruled by Laura Johnson, what did you understand he meant?
That Laura, I believe that Peter Madison reported to Laura as head of social housing within RBKC, and that she had effectively told him that what she wanted would basically take precedent over what Peter Madison was trying to achieve. And as I suppose the major funder for the project, contributor of funds to the project, that he obviously had to take cognizance of what she was saying.
Right, right. So as you understood it, it sounds from what you've just told us that RBKC had some sort of decisive influence about whether or not this contract would be reprocured. Is that right?
It appears so, yes.
It appears so, but did it appear so to you at the time?
Yes.
Really? Did you ask yourself or ask the TMO how that could be?
No, because at the end of the day, that's a relationship above our client.
Were you aware that, as Rob Powell says here, Peter Madison was not keen on progressing with Leadbitter?
I was aware of that, yes, from the meeting.
What gave you that impression? Do you remember?
He had told us that at the meeting.
Do you know why he wasn't keen on progressing with Leadbitter?
I don't know, other than he said that he wasn't keen to progress with Leadbitter. I think whether that was because he was being influenced by or being overruled, or whether that was his own opinion, I don't know.
You don't know? You didn't explore that with him?
No.
Okay. Again, looking at the words of the email, we can see that the objective was value for money. Can you explain what you understood was meant by the preserving programme not being so important and value for money is, or was?
In a construction project, there are three particular criteria which you identify in terms of priorities. So that's time, cost, and quality. And that when we set out on this particular project, time was of the essence in terms of trying to get the project done as quickly as possible and trying to complete it in line with the COUT project. And then this meeting effectively reappraised that in terms of priorities and put value for money as the key priority over programme and ensuring that the project was delivered within the approved budget.
Right. You didn't mention quality in your description after having referred to it. Did you have any impression that given that the programme was not so important, value for money is, where did quality sit in that hierarchy?
I would say that quality and programme were probably of equal importance after the value for money.
After the value for money?
In terms of quality relative to expense of quality, not quality as in deleterious quality.
I follow. I think I follow. I think that are you saying there's a difference when you look at quality between how much you spend on something of equivalent safety on the one hand and saving money by using cheaper products which are less safe on the other?
I'm not saying that, no.
Okay. Can you just explain your last answer?
The quality is in reference to the cost of maybe different types of materials, but they all have to be compliant in terms of whatever regulatory compliance they must conform to.
Yes, I follow. Now let's move forward in time. ART 406232, please. This is an addendum to the status report dated May 2013, and we can see from elsewhere in the document, I didn't, I think, show it to you, that it was issued on the 24th of May. It's on page 3, in fact. We don't need to turn it up. By Rob Powell, and it was distributed to Peter Madison. Did you see this addendum before it went out?
I believe I did, yes.
You did. Can we look at page 5 under the heading Addendum? It's clearly what it is. It's clear what it is. And if we look at the first bullet point, it sits underneath a paragraph that says, in the intervening period and following a meeting the TMO held with Laura Johnson of the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea in the week commencing the 13th of May, the TMO have clarified their position relating to a number of contributory factors to the scheme. Value for money is to be regarded as the key driver for the project. And there are other things as well there. And then if we go to page 6, you can see the first and second paragraphs on page 6. At a meeting between the TMO and Apple Yards on the 21st of May 2013, it was confirmed by the TMO that the question of programme should be considered subordinate to value for money on the project. And then you say, or it says, In light of the foregoing, our original recommendation to review options to replace the contractor, as this will add further risk, cost and time to the project, must now be reconsidered. Indications are that value for money may be enhanced by reprocuring the construction element as opposed to proceeding with the existing contractor arrangement perpetuated from the associated Kensington Academy and Leisure Centre project. We saw that the original recommendation in the status report was based on Artelia's opinion that replacing the contractor would not create the cost savings which had been sought. We saw that in the first edition of this report before this addendum. Can you explain why it is being said here in this addendum report that value for money may be enhanced by reprocuring the construction element?
Because it would push it back into a competitive market. It wasn't actually saying that it would actually bring the project back into budget, which was a different matter entirely.
I think I followed that. The original recommendation was based on your view that replacing the contractor wouldn't create the cost savings that have been sought. But now it's being said that a reprocurement effectively would.
No, what it was saying, there were two different distinct parts here. One is that the brief and the scope of works were exceeding the budget available, so that was the unaffordability. And then in addition to that, the price that was being put forward by lead bidders was even higher than our expectations were in terms of our budget estimate. And that we felt that in terms of changing now to a program-driven, from a program-driven to a value-for-money-driven perspective, that the price that was being offered by lead bidders could actually be achieved. We could achieve a better value for money against that in terms of going through a competitive tender process, but it didn't necessarily mean that it would still be affordable within the TMO's budget.
Well, what would a new contractor do by way of providing value for money that Leadbitter wouldn't or couldn't do?
Because lead bidders were in a negotiation position. They felt that they presumably had this project in the bag because they were already on the CALC project. And one of the things that we couldn't get to the bottom of in being able to interrogate the detail of their price was, for example, to what level that they had allowed for risk or contingencies within the project, which a competitive tender may actually take a view on and take commercial views on, rather than trying to load a price with everything that they could think might actually occur on a project, and therefore hedge their bets, so to speak.
But nothing had changed fundamentally about the circumstances of the project, had it?
Correct.
So, I mean, it was too big for the budget, and the design wasn't controlled. All those factors that you'd spelt out in your April status report remain the position, didn't they?
Correct, and we weren't changing our views on that particular element.
Well, we'll see. Because given that those things hadn't changed, why was reprocurement suddenly a good idea?
Because it was a means of trying to procure a better value price rather than going through a negotiated process. It's a known fact in the industry that negotiated prices are generally higher because people don't feel that they're in competition and therefore are able to put in the levels of profit that they require, and also load prices with all the levels of costs of risks that they may encounter, rather than taking some of those risks on board themselves.
Yes, but I thought you'd accepted that replacing the contractor, not negotiating, but replacing Leadbitter wouldn't create the cost savings sought. That was the effect of the report in April.
Correct. That was replacing Leadbitter wouldn't get that was one of the root causes was that the expectations of the TMO were greater than the affordability of what they had available in their pocket.
Yes.
But then also, we had an issue in terms of trying to negotiate with a contractor who was also trying to push the figures up even higher than our expectation was. So we had one issue was trying to curb the TMO's expectations in terms of their scope of what they wanted to achieve in the project, and the other one was trying to achieve and procure a contractor and secure a contract at a value that was also at a good level. And if the scope had been brought down to a level that was affordable within the budget, then a competitive procurement was more likely to also procure a contractor at that level as well.
I see. So you're saying that the advice not to replace Leadbetter as the main contractor meant that the obverse was keeping Ledbetter as the main contractor, and that would mean you were stuck in a negotiation which would not produce the savings that were required.
Correct, but it didn't mean to say that we wouldn't have to go through a process of value engineering to still achieve a scope of service and a client brief that met the budget that they had available to them.
Now, let's just move on with this document. Page 6, please, which we're on. If you go down to the 4th paragraph, you say there remain 2 options for reprocuring a contractor for the scheme: utilise an appropriate framework to select a contractor and submit a full OJEU compliant procurement exercise. And then you go on to spell out the different advantages of each. At this point, the cost difference, I think, between Artelia and Ledbetter had narrowed quite considerably, hadn't it?
I believe it had, yes.
Yes, I think you were only about, by my calculation, £684,000 apart.
Yep.
Does that sound about right?
Something like that, yes.
Right. And I think, in fact, we could probably see those in some documents. I'm not sure it's necessary to go to that. But do you remember that the difference between TMO and Ledbetter at this point was less than the amount of the contingency?
I can't remember that specifically, no.
Well, let me give you some figures, and we can look at documents if you need to. But in the status report of the 23rd of April we've looked at, the TMO's costs were 9.364 million, which included a contingency of £765,000. Does those figures sound right to you?
It was a project cost,
As a project cost. All right.
I think. I can't remember if that was project.
Well, do you want to have, let's be clear. ART 409101, please, at page 14. Let's just go to those. I wasn't going to take you to them, but we can. And if you go to page 14, you can see what the current position is. And there's a revised estimated construction cost by you as 9.364 million, including £765,000 as a client's contingency. That's why I put it to you as it was a contingency.
Yes.
So those are the figures there. And I think Ledbetter's figures were £684,000 more than that, because, as you can see at the bottom of that very page, 18th of April 2013, Ledbetter's 6th submission is 10.048 million. So you're 684 apart, which is less than the 765 contingency, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes. So there were progressive attempts to align the costs, but there was still a gap. But the gap was only 684,000 at that stage.
Yes.
Now, given that programme was no longer a factor, why was the TMO unwilling to wait for Ledbetter and Artelia to reduce that discrepancy, that £684,000 gap, further, given how close they were?
Because the contingency is a contingency held by the client. So the real difference was the 9.364 less 765 contingency.
Yes,
So if you add the 765 to the £600,000, you're over £1 million worth of difference.
Yes, but are you saying that the 10.048 million therefore didn't include the contingency?
I don't know what was in Ledbetter's figures because we couldn't get the breakdown.
Either way, one can argue about the figures. I've put to you 684, which includes the contingency, which is indeed a client retention. My question again, given that the programme wasn't a material factor anymore, was there not a prospect, at least, that the gap between the client and Ledbetter so close as to be bridgeable at this stage?
No, because the contingency is a contingency held by the client, and that could be for all eventualities from that point of the estimate through to the end of the project. It might have to cover things like discovery later on in the project,
right.
And therefore that contingency is held by the client and is only released as and when there is a need to.
So
therefore you need to look at the net cost, not the gross cost.
I understand that. So, cutting to the chase here, was it your view at the time that this gap, whether it was 684,000 or just about double that, if you take the contingency into account, was an unbridgeable gap?
At that point in time, yes.
Right. And I don't need to show you, I think, that Richard Cloak of Ledbetter, who was Mohic Artelia's manager, was of the view that unless the scope was altered or additional budget was made available, Leadbitter's own view was that the scheme as proposed couldn't be delivered in line with the client's advised budget. That sounds as if it was similar to your view at the time.
Yes.
Yes. At least in accordance with the status report of April.
Correct.
Right. Now, staying with... if we can go back to the status report of the 23rd of April 2013, ART 409101, we're on that. If you go to the bottom of page 18, you said there, in the third bullet point, and I read this to you, replacing the principal contractor at this stage will incur additional time and expense without the guarantee that the TMO would be any better served by the replacement. It looks from the addendum that Artelia's advice had now changed. Is that right? By the time we get to May and the addendum?
Yes.
Yes. Was it Artelia's view that the scheme was still unaffordable given the TMO's budget?
Correct.
Was Artelia of the view that the scope of the project still needed to be redefined?
Yes.
Can you explain why Artelia changed its advice?
Because the change in emphasis from programme to value for money in terms of the drivers, the key drivers from the TMO.
Can we then look at ART 406418, please? This is an email to you from Robert Powell of the 22nd of May 2013, in which to which he attaches his draft addendum to the April report. We've seen the addendum, and in his second paragraph he says, fundamentally, this is a bit of political lubrication to give the TMO justification to go against the recommendation in our original report, which suggested they keep Leadbitter involved with the project. What did you understand by the term political lubrication, Mr. Cash?
I'm not sure what he was trying to imply, other than that having changed the priorities in the drivers that the TMO were looking to apply to the project, that we needed to review what we'd said in the first report, and therefore the status report was going to be presented to the TMO board for approval.
Do we take from this that although you didn't think, or Artelia didn't think, that this was the right advice to go out to a fresh retender, nonetheless you were prepared to give it to help the TMO out politically?
No, this was the addendum had been prepared because there had been a change in drivers, and therefore we had reviewed that in terms of what we'd said originally.
What was the nature of the political problem, as you understood it?
I don't know about any political problems.
Might it have been, and this is perhaps not a question for you but for others, but that the TMO needed a piece of paper to allow them to do what Laura Johnson had demanded?
I don't know.
You don't know. Or did the TMO want different advice so that it could pursue its own agenda of value engineering?
I don't know.
Did you understand that the TMO had actually asked Artelia to produce an addendum report in which the advice was changed?
I can't remember if it did or not. I knew that an addendum would be required because of the change in circumstances.
Right. You don't know who'd prompted the production of that addendum?
I can't remember, but it may have been something that was discussed at the original meeting that we had, where the changes had originally been discussed.
Right.
In terms of the drivers.
Were you giving advice just to suit the TMO's purposes here?
No.
Right. If I can show you ART 408984, page 29, this is Mr. Powell's witness statement. We'll get your comment on it, see if you agree with what he says. But paragraph 89, he refers to the addendum, and he says in the third line, in fact, I'll read it all to you. The addendum is a reflection of the changed parameters for the project. The TMO clearly hoped that the revised approach would provide better value for money, with the programme being less important. The TMO had been prompted by RBKC to change its focus to a different order of priorities, having previously accepted the advice we had given it. If all the TMO had was a status report from AUK advising on a different course of action to the one adopted based upon an earlier order of priorities which had been superseded, that would leave the TMO without the full story on paper. As the order of priorities had changed, we needed to reflect that. Do you agree with that?
That's the first statement, yes.
Right. Can we then move on to ART 409020? This is an email chain between Artelia and the TMO. I'll just wait for it to come up. In May 2013. And if I go to page 2, we can see that you were copied in on this email chain. And if we look at page 2, in the middle of the page, we can see an email that Mr. Powell sent sent to Peter Madison attaching the addendum report. And you're copied in on that.
Yes.
Peter, please find attached the addendum to our report we discussed. This should now give you the comfort you're looking for to proceed with looking to reprocure the construction against our earlier recommendation, which was based on now obsolete information. And if we scroll up to page 1, we can see a further email to David Gibson 20 minutes later. You see that? Where Robert Powell essentially sends him the email he'd sent below to Peter Madison, also copying you in. David, apologies, I left you off my earlier correspondence to Peter, attached as a copy of our addendum to our report. And then at the top of the page, David Gibson writes to Robert Powell 4 days later, 28th of May, thanking him and saying in the second paragraph, the recommendations within the addendum are in line with our discussions of last week and allows us to progress towards reprocuring the construction. Do you know what discussions Mr. Gibson is referring to there?
No.
Were you involved in any of those discussions, do you think?
I don't believe so.
Right. Do you accept that in this email it looks as if the TMO had discussed with Artelia what recommendations they wanted Artelia to make?
No, I don't think that's, I wouldn't agree with that. I would say that they'd had a conversation about what the recommendations were. I don't know, it doesn't seem to imply that the TMO were actually telling us what to write.
No, I'm not suggesting that quite. I'm just asking you what your understanding of this email was.
That there'd been a conversation about the changes required as a result of the changes in the drivers on the project, and that an addendum would have to be written because it would have to reflect the changes in TAC in terms of recommendations.
Yeah, I mean, on the face of this email, it looks, and I just want you to comment on it, it looks as if there were discussions first, and then the addendum was drafted to be in line with those.
Yes.
Yes. So this wasn't discussions about the addendum, this was an addendum to reflect the discussions. Is that fair?
Yes, but
Yes.
I don't know whether the discussions were about what might be in the addendum, just to give the TMO an advance indication of what was going to be included.
Do you know what the information was that Mr. Powell had said had become obsolete, which he'd referred to in his earlier email?
In terms of the recommendations to continue with negotiations with Leadbitter on the basis that time was of the key driver rather than in value for money.
Right. That wasn't really information becoming obsolete. That was an instruction changing, isn't it? That's
Correct,
really
yes.
the right way of looking at it.
Yeah.
Can we then go to ART 409106? We move now into the early part of June 2013, and these are the minutes of a TMA meeting on the 6th of June, and we can see that you attended this meeting, as did Peter Madison.
Yes.
You see that. And again, the notes, Appleyard's notes, quality, author, Booth, check, Robert Powell. And if we go to the first item, attachments, project number 1, project brief, and the first item is the approval of the revised project brief. We saw that earlier. And then underneath that, item 2, contractual procurement, 2.1, PM, Peter Madison, requested Appleyards to review the previous addendum report to include greater detail on programme and costs to demonstrate that tendering the contract will deliver greater value for money, the main project driver. By that, did you, and you were present as we know, did you understand that the TMO had asked for a further revision of the addendum report? In other words, that addendum draft we saw a little bit earlier, the one from May, that we've just been looking at.
Yes, that he wanted it in more detail.
Right. Do you remember what was discussed at this meeting in relation to reviewing that draft of the addendum report, the May addendum report?
I can't remember the detail, no.
Right. When it says that there was to be greater detail on programme and costs, quotes, to demonstrate that tendering the contract will deliver greater value for money, the main project driver. Do you remember that this was the TMO telling you what your advice should be in a revised addendum?
No.
Or giving instructions about the subject matter and purpose of the amendments to that addendum?
I don't believe so. I think he was effectively looking for more detail and felt that what we'd said in the report wasn't sufficiently detailed.
What was wrong with your addendum as at May that you'd approved and sent out?
I can't remember.
Did you think there was something wrong with it? Something incomplete about it? Something insufficient about it?
I didn't think so at the time. I can't remember specifically.
No. Did you disagree with Mr. Madison and say, well, look, you've got enough in that?
I don't remember saying anything to the contrary, though.
Right. Did it come as a surprise to you that Peter Madison had asked you to give greater detail on programme and costs for the purposes of demonstrating that the contract will deliver greater value for money?
I can't remember.
Right. Is it fair to say, looking back on it, that the May version of the addendum didn't quite give Peter Madison enough of the political lubrication that he was after?
I don't know.
Well, you must have had an impression at the time. You were at the meeting.
I wouldn't know in terms. I didn't think of it in terms of political lubrication. I thought of it more as a report to give a status at a particular point in time. I wasn't thinking of it in terms of any other use other than giving a recommendation for taking the project forward.
No, I mean, just looking at it from a little distance, you produced a detailed status report in April. You'd had a change of instructions, you would put it, in later on, and produced an addendum in May responding to the new situation. My question really is, why did it not occur to you at the time that that was enough? And ask yourself why it was that Peter Madison wanted further detail.
We quite often write reports and we think they're in sufficient detail, and clients come back to us and saying that they require further detail to allow them to explain or to pass on to others.
Yeah, I see. All right. Well, let's see how this pans out. We're going to go to ART 406181, please. Now, this is a revision to the original status report of April 2013, and as you can see from the front page, updated 18th of June 2013. And oddly, it says next to the words in brackets, 22nd of April 2013. And just while we're on it, can you explain why the original April status report bore the date of the 23rd of April, but this one says 22nd of April, updated 18th June?
I can only assume that the 22nd and 23rd, there was an error.
Oh, I see. Now, there's not two different versions, are there?
Well, it says it's an updated report.
Right. Let's look at page 27 of this document. This is the June update of the April status report. And there we can see that there's an addendum which is now added to this document. So it's been implanted into the status report by way of a June update. Have I got that right?
Yes.
Looking at this addendum, does this look familiar to you?
Yes.
Did you write this, do you think?
No, I didn't.
Did you approve it at the time?
I would have reviewed it.
Right, as part of your review of the update?
Yeah.
Yes. And if we look at page 27 at the top, it says there that the TMO have clarified their position. And you can see it says there, in the intervening period between the issue and of the original draft of this report and following a meeting the TMO held with Laura Johnson of the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea in week commencing 13th May 2013, the TMO have clarified their position relating to a number of contributing factors to the scheme. And that's what we saw from the original addendum. And then again, value for money is to be regarded as the key driver for the project. And then the other bullet points, again, all identical to the 24th of May first draft of the addendum. Yes?
Yes.
And then Looking below that, we can see things that are familiar. And then if you go to page 28 of this document, from the third paragraph from the bottom, this text is new, isn't it? Given that the amended project brief gives primacy to value for money for the project, we recommend that the TMO re-procures the principal contractor through an OJEU-compliant open market tender. That's, I think, new, isn't it?
I believe so, yes.
That wasn't even in the addendum in May, was it?
No.
Were you comfortable that that recommendation reflected your own professional opinion?
I believe it reflected the opinion of Robert Powell. I'm not sure. I can't say for myself because I wasn't actually the author of the document.
You believe it reflected the opinion of Robert Powell. Did you have a discussion with Robert Powell about this paragraph?
I can't remember.
Were you comfortable with this document going out with that in it? That
Yes.
paragraph in it, you were. Can you explain why it took you or others at Artelia between the 6th of June and the meeting we saw and the 18th of June to make these changes and add these additions at the end here?
This was, I think, the reason it went down this route was because we felt that lead shouldn't be excluded from a re-procurement exercise, and if you went down a framework route that where they weren't on that particular framework, having already had it as part of their original tender under the CALC project, they may be able to raise objections, and therefore we felt that an OJEU compliant tender would still allow leadbitters the opportunity to bid on an open market if they so wished, and therefore avoiding any risk of them coming back with a formal complaint in terms of the procurement process.
Can we go to ART 401241, please? This is an email from you to Peter Madison on the 19th of June 2013, and you attach a status report, June version 5 final. You see
Yes.
that? Peter, you say, apologies for the delay in issuing this to you, but it has taken longer than anticipated to update our status report following our discussion last week. I'm aware that you have a board meeting tomorrow and may not have sufficient time to review what I've written, but in essence I've taken on board your comments and reworded sections to read in a better light. Now, you refer there to discussions last week. That's the week before, obviously, the week of this email. Do you remember having discussions with Peter Madison?
Yes, I do.
What was the gist of those discussions? Can you tell us?
Yes, he wasn't happy that within the report that we were raising criticisms of the TMO.
Right. So he wanted you to produce a report that was less critical of the TMO.
Correct.
Right. Now, when we compare the documents, the April status report with the June update, we see not only the addition of the addendum as changed itself, as we've seen, but also other things as well. And I wonder whether we can look at those. Let's go, and I'm going to do a compare and contrast. Can we go, first of all, to the status report, the original April status report, page 5. That's ART 409101, page 5. And there's a bullet point list there, which I've showed you before, the 7 bullets, starting with client brief has been allowed to develop in a piecemeal fashion over time. And at least the first 4 of those are critical of the TMO, aren't they?
Yes.
Yes.
Sorry, the first three.
The first 3, but also historic relationships and contractual position regarding the associated CALC project may have frustrated good and proactive progress. That's also reasonably critical of the TMO.
It is, but I think that was in particular reference to leadbitters as well.
All right, fair enough. But I take the point. But the first 3 are certainly critical of the TMO, and the 4th one includes a criticism of the TMO. Then if we compare that with the updated version of the June report, the update, this is ART 406181, page 5. You can see now that there's been a change And instead of saying client brief has been allowed to develop in a piecemeal fashion over time, it now says the development of the client brief went through a number of iterations over time, expanding to reflect the desired objectives. So that's a change that has been made in order to cast the TMO in a better light, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes. And the next bullet point was absence of a controlled and managed scope for the project, and etc. And that's all gone. And now you've got a perceived poor commitment from Leadbitter to demonstrate a full commitment to this project. The indications are that this project was not properly resourced due to the parallel demand of calc. That's a new bullet point, isn't it?
It's, yes, it is. And that, I think, is in replacement of the fourth bullet point of the previous report.
Yes, and the second and third bullet points have gone as well, haven't they?
Yes.
Yes. So you've taken out the critical second and third bullet points and replaced it with a much less critical fourth bullet point that really just fires at Leadbitter and excludes the TMO.
Yes.
Again, it's to put the TMO in a better light, to be blunt.
Yes.
Yeah. The indications that you refer to there, the indications are that this project was not properly resourced. What was that a reference to?
In terms of Leadbitter's commitment to the project, we felt that their priorities were on the calc project, and we didn't think that that they had sufficiently resourced project in terms of being able to respond to the questions that we were asking for, and also because there were a number of meetings that had been arranged with Leadbitters where they didn't actually turn up.
Yeah, this is a new reason, though, isn't it? I mean, these aren't reasons that were reflected in the original addendum, original report of April, were they?
I think it was referred to in a roundabout way in the fourth bullet point in terms of the existing relationships with the calc project.
Yeah. So you beefed up blaming Leadbitter and let the TMO off the hook on this one.
In that sense.
Yeah. Because the truth is, as you've told us, that the issue prompting the removal of Leadbitter was actually a change in the priorities of the client to reflect value for money.
That was the change in the tack on the priority and the drivers, yes.
Yes. And I think you've accepted that the criticism of the TMO about a late commitment to budget has been removed. Now, am I right in thinking that you agreed with these statements when this status report went out?
I didn't necessarily agree with them personally, no.
Why did you let them out then to Peter Madison if you didn't agree with them?
Peter Madison and I had a particularly strong conversation about the changes that had to be made. He was being very persistent and put a lot of pressure on us to make those changes. I was quite resistant because I felt that it was a true reflection of what had happened on the project. But at the same time, this was a report that Peter Madison was looking to present to his board, and that if we didn't make the changes, then the report wouldn't be presented to the board, and therefore no decision would be made or no recommendations would be drawn from that, and therefore the whole basis of the report would have failed completely.
So you were basically strong-armed into making these changes?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, is that a convenient moment?
Yes, I would think it is. Thank you very much. We'll have another break now, Mr. Cash.
Thank you.
We'll come back at 25 to 4, please. And usual rules, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence or anything to do with it while you're out.
All right.
All right?
Thank you.
Go to the usher, please.
Thank you.
25 to 4, please. Thank you. Yes, would you ask Mr. Cash to come back in, please? Okay. Right, Mr. Cash, all ready to carry on?
Yes.
Very good. Let's pour yourself some water, then we'll start.
Thank you.
Yes,
Right, ready?
Mr. Cash, just finishing off on the last topic before we move to another one, can I ask you to go to TMO 48490? This is an internal email of the 17th of September 2013 from David Gibson to Claire Williams. Now, obviously, you're not copied in on it, but it follows on from, or forwards, I think, to Claire Williams, the email that you had sent to Peter Madison and copied to David Gibson on the 19th of June. So this is 2 months later. And what David Gibson tells Claire Williams is this: Claire, re-VFM through procurement. This is all I have seen from Appleyards, and we had to twist their arms quite hard for them to write it. Have a quick look at the executive summary and see if it fits the bill. As I say, you didn't see this exchange at the time, but do you agree with that characterisation of the circumstances in which you amended the status report?
Yes, I do.
Yes. Can I then turn to value engineering as a topic? And I want to start by asking you some questions about value engineering as a matter of principle. First, in 2013, what was your understanding of what value engineering was or meant?
It's a process which is common to most projects that challenges a design or a concept to ensure that what is being proposed is giving the best value in terms of the client's objectives.
Was it usual to have value engineering on projects like the Grenfell Tower project?
Yes, it's common on, I think, virtually all projects that I've been involved in.
Can we look at your first witness statement, please, then, at paragraph 52 on page 15? You say that VE is a well-known term in the construction industry, and you say, while to some degree views differ as to its precise meaning, in my view, VE involves achieving the same scope of work required by a client, but at better value. VE does not involve a change in the scope of work or any reduction in performance or function or a loss of an element of the work altogether. In terms of better value, that value is not necessarily always a reduction in cost, although usually it does achieve a cost saving. And then you go on to give examples. And your emphasis here, and I'm summarising the paragraph, tell me if this is unfair, but you're emphasising cost savings without a loss of performance and functionality.
Correct.
Yes. And is that important as a qualification? In other words, you can have cost savings as part of a valuation engineering exercise or value engineering exercise, but you mustn't have loss of performance or functionality.
That's the purpose, yes.
Yes. When you're doing a VE exercise, which is more important, the reduction in the cost or the preservation of performance or functionality?
The reduction in cost is not the key objective. It's about actually trying to maybe achieve the targets better, and
Yes.
that may or may not be.
Where a
the
different
benefits.
material delivers better value, how carefully, when doing a VE exercise, would you examine any potential to compromise performance or functionality?
I think that's part of an overall technical review that would be carried out by the team as a whole.
Right. And you say an overall technical review carried out by the team as a whole. Just looking at it broadly on this project, who would carry out that exercise in the context of the adoption of any particular material on the Grenfell Tower project?
In terms of the pre-construction phases, that would be Studio E, Max Fordham and Curtains.
Right, and after the design and build contractor had been appointed?
Then the expectation would be that Ryden, as the design and build contractor, would identify what the benefits are in terms of putting forward any alternative proposals, and the TMO, in terms of having taken on board the role of technical review, would also review that themselves as well.
Right. Now, can I ask you to go to page 16 of this document, this witness statement? paragraph 54, you say, like AUK, Studio E was doing its job by raising VE. I believe that on almost every construction project I've ever worked on, VE has been considered at some stage. It is just part and parcel of good practice in the construction industry and trying to get the client the best value for its money. So is it your experience that value engineering is something that an advisor, such as Studio E, would always raise with a client at any stage?
I believe it should be.
Right. And in the paragraph immediately above it, you say, in contrast, a reduction in scope, this is a contrast with value engineering, in contrast, a reduction in scope involves a change in design that is actually reducing performance or function, or removing an element of work altogether. So, summarising it, is it your view that after a value engineering process, the design should achieve the same level of safety as before?
I don't. Whatever, whether it be a reduction in scope or a value engineering, there should be no reduction in standards of safety.
Right. So whether it's VE or a reduction in scope, the design should still achieve the same level of safety.
Yes, in terms of regulatory compliance.
Yes. And in practical terms, would you expect that somebody within the team, the design team, would check or analyse whether each of the design changes which are proposed as part of a value engineering exercise, or perhaps product or specification changes, were compliant with all applicable regulations and statutory requirements?
Yes, I would.
And on the Grenfell Tower project, I think you've given me the answer before. That was, is it right? Studio E up to the point at which Ryden were appointed, and after that it was Ryden.
So it'd be Studio E, Curtains and Max Fordham in their capacity in respect of whatever that saving might be or whatever that value engineering aspect might be.
Until the tender?
Correct.
I follow.
And after that, Max Fordham were retained by the TMO.
Yes.
And so Max Fordham and the TMO and Ryden's.
Yes. And what sort of check or analysis would you expect those entities to carry out in order to ensure that value engineering had not compromised performance or functionality?
Depending on what the V item might be, that they would look at specifications for compliance with statutory requirements, British standards, and such codes of practice and things like that.
Now, did you or anybody else at Artelia ever investigate whether a check or an analysis had been done as part of the value engineering exercise that we come to see to make sure that there had been no compromise to functionality or performance?
If there were proposals being put forward, we would look to the design team to carry out those checks.
Yes, you would. But did anybody at Artelia ever check that those checks had been carried out by the design team, whoever they were at the time?
I can't say for sure.
Is there any reason why Artelia wouldn't have done its best to make sure that whoever was doing the checks, they'd been done properly?
We should have done, and I hope we would have done.
Okay, you should have done it, you say. And hopefully would have done. Right, let's then turn to the valuation exercise, the value engineering exercise in 2013. In general, I think you would accept that throughout the early stages of the project, so from inception in 2012 through 2013, there was substantial change in the design of the project. We've seen examples of that.
Yes.
Let's just look at a couple more. If you go to ART 409057, this is an email chain between Bruce Soanes of Studio E and Alan Dawson in March 2013. And it starts, in fact, at the end of February of that year. If you go to page 5, please. This is an email on page 5 of the 26th of February 2013 from Bruce Soanes to Alan Dawson. And he says, it's not really possible to undertake a radical rethink without sight of the figures. A discussion with the client and involvement with the services engineer, who's not copied into your email, is the M&E not under review as well? Now, of course, this is at the point at which there's discussion about cost, because the difficulties with Leadbitters had arisen in terms of bridging the gap. And he sets out some obvious targets, as he calls them, for savings. Omit garages, baseline, undercroft work, change zinc cladding material to something cheaper. See that?
Yes.
Now, those changes are quite substantial, aren't they?
Yes, some of them are.
Or would be. And you can see, if you go up the email chain to the bottom of page 4, Alan Dawson's reply is, in the last paragraph of that reply, he says, most of your list seems to be omissions or downgrading the spec as opposed to VE. Would you agree that at least some of those proposed changes that he was proposing were actually reducing the scope of the project and not value engineering at all?
They appear to be, yes.
Yes. And did you think at that time that there might have to be a reduction in quality in order to meet the TMO's budget?
Possibly, in terms of its expectations of the level of specification in terms of quality.
Right.
But not in terms of its conformity.
No, I understand. Was there any area of the specification at that stage where you thought quality could be compromised in order to achieve more successful value engineering?
I didn't really think of it at the time, but I know that cladding had been a discussion point, obviously, for some time.
I follow. So, from that answer, and indeed the email that we see as early as February 2013, do we take it that, so far as you are concerned, the cladding was always in the frame, if I can use an expression, for value engineering?
The selection of the type of cladding was always in the frame because it had not been finalised. There were a number of discussions, and although there was the Studio E were trying to pursue one particular type of cladding, I don't think any clear decision had been made as to whether it might be one particular cladding or another. But it was more a case of the fact that the cladding had to have a certain level of performance.
Yeah. Did you, just looking at what Mr. Soanes says about the cladding, change zinc cladding material to something cheaper, and Alan Dawson's response where he says most of the list seems to be emissions or downgrading the spec as opposed to VE, did you think that the change from zinc to something cheaper was a downgrading of the spec?
No, not necessarily.
Right. Not necessarily. What would make it a downgrading of the spec?
If the performance ratings were different to those that were expected.
I follow. Can we then move to a different topic, which is Ryden's appointment? And I'm going to come back, I think, later to the question of value engineering once Ryden are on board. Can we go to Artelia's contractual obligations once again and go back to the EA schedule at ART 405742 at page 48. Now, at the bottom of the page there, in the left-hand column, we can see tick box 1.42, and this is under the heading 1.4 Pre-Construction RIBA Outline Plan of Work 2007. And that tick box is not ticked, 1.4.2, and it's advise on suitable tenderers for the building contract, prepare recommendations for the client's approval. By that, Mr. Cash, do I understand it correctly that Artelia's position is that it did not have an obligation to advise the TMO on who to appoint as the main contractor?
No, this is a generic set of scopes of services and therefore are to be used not only in public procurement but also in private procurement. And sometimes when we go in terms of private procurement, where we don't have to go through a public process, then it is up to us to put forward suggested names of contractors that we think might be suitable for long listing or short listing to a tender. And in this particular instance, we were not being, because it was a public procurement, we wouldn't be going through that process, which was why that box was not ticked.
So is the short answer to my question that because this was to be an OJEU compliant tender, your advice on suitable tenderers wasn't required and therefore the box wasn't ticked?
Correct.
Right. However, it's right, I think, as a matter of fact, in other words, what happened on the ground was that Artelia, as the employer's agent for the TMO, so I think Phil Booth actually, and also as QS, Miss Lim, in fact, were both involved in all of the stages of the OJEU procurement process, weren't they?
Correct.
Now, moving forward in time then, we know that several bidders returned bids during the OJEU process. Can we look at ART 405886, please? This is an email chain of the 14th of February 2014 to you, Mr. Cash, from Trichen Lim, and this is about prices.
Yes.
And if we scroll to the bottom of page 1 and over to page 2, we can start by looking at her email to you of the 14th of February 2014, bottom of page 1, and then let's look at the top of page 2. She says, "Hi Simon, just to let you know that the lowest tender is 9.25 million, exclamation mark. Thanks." That was from Ryden, wasn't it?
The tender, yes.
Yes, the tender. Now, we can see from documents that in early 2014, Ms. Lim had actually reanalysed the budget, and she herself had costed the budget at £10.045 million, £10,045,000. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And we don't need to show you a document for that, just for our internal purposes and everyone who wants to look at it. It's ART 405805, which is Artelia's updated final tender report of the 17th of March 2014. And you'll find that figure on page 12. That's just to put that into the transcript. Just so, looking at those two figures, the 9.25 million from Ryden and Artelia's own figure of over 10 million, they were coming in at just around about a million, perhaps just about 900,000 actually, less than Ms. Lim's estimate.
Yes.
Yeah. But it was still, at 9.249 million, about £750,000 higher than the TMO's own budget of 8.415 million.
Correct.
Yes. Now, if we can just look up to page 1 in this email run, we can see that you come back and say, on the same day, in fact, about 3 minutes later, no, 6 minutes later, or even 8 minutes later. Good result then. What did they miss, and who is it? Can you just explain what you meant by good result? Why was it a good result?
Because the tender was within our pre-tender estimate, which that included a level of contingency as well. So we were satisfied that we weren't way out in terms of telling the TMO that the works were over budget.
Right. So a good result because it was a very low figure.
Not because it was a low figure, but because it was within what we had predicted.
Right. Okay. So you say the 10 odd million that Ms. Lim had produced was a prediction, was it?
Yes.
I mean, you were using that as a benchmark figure, were you?
It's an indication. Yes.
So
It's not meant to be a competitive tender.
No, indeed. No, we mean your figure wasn't.
Correct.
No. So they had beaten it by about £900,000, and that was the good result.
Yes, but bear in mind that Ms. Lim's figure also included an element of contingencies as well.
Indeed. Now you go on to say, what did they miss? Was your initial impression that Ryden's price was unrealistic?
No, it was a light-hearted quip.
It may have been a light-hearted quip, but it reveals a deeper truth. Perhaps, and I just wonder what that deeper truth is. Did you think they might have made a mistake?
No.
So why did you say, what did they miss?
As I say, it was a quip to, I suppose, rile Miss Lim in terms of saying to her that maybe they had got something wrong, but it wasn't meant in any particular way other than that.
Was the quip perhaps provoked by the size of the underbid, under the 10 odd million that Ms. Lim had calculated?
No.
Right. Did you have any concerns at this stage that Ryden's bid might mean that they were coming in unrealistically low?
No.
So therefore, it would follow that you didn't have any concerns that at that price, quality and safety were somehow being sacrificed in favour of a low price?
No.
Did you have any thoughts at the time that if Ryden's tender offer had been accepted, that Ryden might later be under financial pressure to produce the project or develop the project on budget?
No.
You didn't. Did the TMO ever ask you at any stage about the sustainability of Ryden's bid at that level?
Not that I recall.
Did you or anyone else at Artelia consider whether it was an abnormally low tender which might itself be unsustainable?
No.
Right. Okay. If we go then to ART 402197, look at the first page. This is Artelia's final tender report, dated the 12th of March 2014. We looked at this, I think, yesterday, and I just want to just show you page 13 in that document. And if you look at that page, you can see 6 paragraphs down, there is a table, and just above that, 2 sentences up, it says, overall, the table on page 7 reveals broadly consistent pricing at a sustainable level. And it may be that that's a reference to a wrong reference to a page number. It doesn't matter. Given the discrepancies between Artelia's own costings and total cost and Ryden's own price, and indeed between the other bidders and Ryden's price, did Artelia really think that the pricings were consistent?
Yes.
And sustainable?
Yes, we did.
You see, Ryden had come in substantially below the other bidders, hadn't they?
Yes.
And substantially below Artelia's own benchmarking. And I just wonder why it is, given how low Ryden was, and given your initial quip that Ryden must have missed something, quip though it may have been, you really thought it was a sustainable and consistent price, consistent with all the others.
Miss Lim had done a review of the tender price that they submitted and the analysis that they submitted, and felt that the prices were not unreasonable.
Right. Do you accept that the statement that we see here, that there is broadly consistent pricing at a sustainable level, might have given the TMO comfort that the project scope as set by them could be delivered for the right price set by Ryden or quoted by Ryden?
Yes.
Right. Can I then turn to the question of Mr. Blake's relationship with Mr. Madison and what you knew of that? Now, we saw earlier an email of the 1st of October 2015.
I didn't know of it.
No, there's the topic of what you
Sorry.
knew. I'm not, this is what I want to explore. I'm not jumping to the conclusion. I just want to ask you about it. This is ART 406206. And we looked at it earlier on in your evidence, dated the 1st of October 2015. And it's about a conversation that you had with Peter Madison of the TMO about Steve Blake. And in the first paragraph in line 2, you say to him, he, that's Peter Madison, is conscious that his relationship with Steve goes back a long way and Steve talks to him direct. However, Peter doesn't want that relationship to circumvent Artelia and bypass the role that we are playing in trying to get the project finished to the required quality and within budget. Now, when you say that he is conscious that his relationship with Steve goes back a long way and Steve talks to him direct, when did you first find out that they knew each other at all? Do you remember?
I think it was not long before. It was not long before this when it became apparent that they were having direct conversations that were leaving us out of the loop, which is why I then had the conversation with Peter Madison.
Yes. How did you find out that they were having conversations direct and leaving you out of the loop?
I can't remember precisely, but I think it would have been through a conversation with Neil Reed.
When you say to Neil Reed, he is conscious that his relationship with Steve goes back a long way, is that something that Peter Madison told you?
Yes.
Do you remember what he said to you?
I can't remember specifically. I was just trying to recount what came up in the conversation.
Right. Did he give you any indication of how far his relationship with Steve Blake went back?
I don't believe so.
Right. Did you ask him?
I don't think so.
Right. What did you glean at all, if anything, about their relationship?
That they had worked together for some time in the past, and that obviously Steve Blake was talking to him and trying to have conversations in regard to the delivery on the project, which should have actually been coming through us.
Did you have any concerns that the relationship as described to you by Mr. Madison might somehow compromise to the TMO's, particularly Mr. Madison's, impartiality about Ryden and its performance and its pricing?
There was nothing in the conversation that implied that, no.
Did you yourself have any inkling or concerns about
No.
that? Can we then go back in time to 2014? And I want to show you RYD 30866643, please. Now, if we go to the bottom of page 1, we can see that this is an internal email on the 20th of February 2014 from Katie Bachelier to Simon Lawrence and others in Ryden. And she says, I have just called Peter Blythe from Artelia to see if there was any early feedback on our tender. In short, the answer was not yet, but he did mention that they will be holding interviews on 5th of March. He couldn't tell me at this stage whether we would be invited or not, but we should hear by the end of next week. Might be worth putting the date in diaries just in case. In your experience, was it common at the time to give feedback to bidders on their tenders during the OJEU process?
Not at all.
Not at all. You say not at all in quite firm terms. Was that because that would be forbidden?
Yes.
Yes. Yes. Can we then go to RYD 30866648? This is another internal email within Ryden, now on the 6th of March 2014, so a couple of weeks later and into the OJEU tender process. And we can see here that Steve Blake is telling Tim Shuttler at Ryden, copy to Jeff Henton, that at the housing conference, we had meetings with senior representatives from K&C, and my opinion is that in the event we were a successful contractor, they would have no issue signing up to a form of documentation as we suggest. And then 2 lines down, he says, we have been informally advised that we are in pole position, ours to lose. Were you aware that Ryden had been informed informally of its performance in the tender, even before the interviews had taken place?
No, I wasn't.
If you had discovered that fact, what would your reaction have been?
It would have been the tender process had been compromised.
Right. And what would the consequence of that have been?
Effectively, it could have voided the tender process.
Right. So the informal information that Ryden were in pole position, ours to lose, was irregular and improper, yes?
Yes.
Right. And would you have been unhappy if Artelia employees had told the bidder that they were likely to win before the close of the OJEU process?
Yes.
We then just move on this topic. Back a few days in time, but on in the topic. ART 406433, please. This is an email from Jenny Jackson of the 3rd of March 2014, so just a few days before we were looking at it. You're copied into this. In the first line, she says that she wants to discuss I'm just looking at the email. Yes, you are copied into it, although it's an email from her to David Gibson. And she says, we need to think how this will be presented to the board. We will be asking them to sign a contract for a contract sum in excess of the current budget. The contract specifically includes a term referring to value engineering, and if necessary, work can be omitted. I'm in the office tomorrow and we can discuss how this will be presented. And then, if you go to page 2 of this document, that's how it culminates, but I wanted to show you that first.
Yes.
It is the end result of a discussion that starts on, essentially, on page 2. And she sends to you an email of the 2nd of March, which I want to show you. And you can see that it says, please can we discuss how we intend to bridge the gap between the £9.249 odd million tender submitted and the £8.5 million client budget. And then she says, the advice obtained from Chiles and Hamlins is clear. And then we have a different typeface. And I better read it to you. KCTMO has advertised the contract as a restricted procedure based on an estimated contract value of £8 million to £10 million. Tenderers are required to submit a price for undertaking the programme, and KCTMO is required to assess the tenders based on the price/quality criteria you have set out in the tender documents. The restricted procedure does not permit a contracting authority to undertake negotiations with the tenderers prior to contract award, and does not provide for the contracting authority to revise the tender document or for tenderers to submit revised best and final offers. To do so would be a breach of the EU regulations, even if you allowed all the tenderers to renegotiate their prices. Your only EU-compliant options are to assess the tenders and award the contract to the tenderer who scored the highest based on your price/quality criteria, or not award the contract and run a new procurement exercise. If the contract allows it, you may run value engineering exercises with your selected tenderer, but only once the contract has been entered into. So that was the advice. And then she goes on to say, in the event that there is a formal challenge, we may be required to disclose some/elements of the formal report. So I suggest the references to value engineering are removed for the moment. I think the way forward is to enter into the contract for £9.249294 million and then embark on the VE post-award so that the award is on the basis of if the published evaluation criteria, of the published evaluation criteria. There will need to be some informal, quotes-unquote, discussion with the preferred contractor prior to award, so there is an understanding of the approach. Views, ? Now, we then see your response to this, Mr. Cash, if we go to it, which is over the page to page 1, and you say, this is 3rd of March, next day, Jenny, I agree with you in terms of placing the contract at the submitted tender value and an offline discussion with the preferred contractor, particularly to set out the intent once a contract has been entered into. There is absolutely nothing to say that once in contract, the KCTMO cannot look for ways of making savings, and as part of the informal discussion, the intention can be made clear, and although not binding, the contractor's agreement sought to work with the KCTMO to achieve the required savings. Some savings have already been identified, and the contractor may well put forward others for consideration during the discussions that can be investigated prior to entering into contract. Do you remember this email chain?
Yes, I do.
Yes. Now, at this point that you write your email, 3rd of March, there's been no formal notification to any of the bidders, had there?
None.
And the OJEU process was considering, wasn't it? It was continuing, wasn't it?
Correct.
Yes. There were interviews still outstanding, yes?
Yes.
And the question here was how to bridge the gap between the TMO's budget and Ryden's price. But you had no discussions about bridging that gap yet, had you?
No.
Sorry.
I was going to say, actually, the discussion was more about the TMO signing off the appointment of a contractor at a value over their approved budget.
Yes, and you had no discussions about bridging that gap between the TMO's price and any other tenderer's price either, had you?
Correct.
Yes. So what was contemplated, I think, was an informal discussion with Ryden about value engineering and not the 3 other tenderers.
There were only 2 others at that time that were being considered.
In the end, that's correct. But I'm right on my point, aren't I, that there wasn't any contemplation of even any informal discussion with those other tenderers, only with Ryden.
That's correct.
Can we then go back just to Jenny Jackson's advice on page 2? I showed you this a minute ago, but I just want to focus on it. Oops. Yes, she says there, as I've shown you, that she suggests that references to value engineering are removed for the moment in the formal reports. Did you support the advice to remove mentioning value engineering?
I can't remember if I made any objections or not at the time, but so I can't say for sure.
Right. Did you understand, looking at the last paragraph of her advice or view, that she meant that value engineering exercises could only be conducted post-award?
Yes, that was the intention.
And what did you understand post-award meant in that context?
Post confirmation of appointment of Rydens.
Right. So not, therefore, before notification of the preferred bidder?
Correct.
Or indeed in the standstill period, after the notification?
Correct.
Yes. Or indeed at the end of the standstill period, or do you think at that point you could discuss it?
At the end of the standstill period, then we would be in a position because they would have been effectively selected.
Right, I see. So I think you would say you could only properly start discussing value engineering at the end of the standstill period and not before.
Correct.
But she is, of course, saying that the TMO can have an informal, quotes unquote, discussion prior to award so that the contractor can understand, quotes, the approach. Now, to the naked eye, Mr. Cash, she is saying that although you can't actually seek to negotiate a bidder's price, you can tell them informally, off the record as it were, that the TMO would want to have a value engineering discussion as part of the contract they will enter. That's how it looks. Is that how you understood it?
As my understanding was that yes, it was to set out the principles of what would happen post-award.
Indeed. And is this wrong? That, in other words, she's saying that the TMO can seek to get some tacit agreement from Ryden that they will enter into a contract that includes a VE exercise.
Not so much a tacit agreement, it was an understanding, which would not be, it's not a binding agreement in any way. And it was there to try and give her the ability to provide comfort to the board of the TMO to sign off a contract value in excess of their approved budget.
All right, let's try it a different way. That she was suggesting an informal, as it were, nod and a wink agreement, not binding in law, from Ryden in advance of them being notified that they were the preferred bidder.
I wouldn't call it a nod and a wink. I think that's an incorrect reference. I think it's more a case of the way I saw it was having a conversation with the preferred bidder, but not actually telling them that they were preferred bidder, in terms of saying that this is the approach that would happen in the event that they might be awarded a project.
Indeed. Now let's go back to what you say about this at page 1. You refer there to having an offline discussion with the preferred contractor. When did you envisage that offline discussion, as you put it, would take place?
That it would happen at a point in time before award of the contract.
Right. In other words, before notification of the preferred bidder?
Before, yes.
Right. And by offline discussion, do you mean secret?
I suppose it's secret because it's not actually in conjunction with discussions with anybody else.
That was my next question. And was the purpose of that offline discussion so that the TMO could get some sort of, if not binding agreement, then comfort from the contractor in an informal way that they would work with the TMO to achieve savings?
Yes, but not with any particular reference to them being a preferred contractor.
Does it come to this, that the TMO, it was all right with you that the TMO could make some sort of, or come to some sort of informal understanding with Ryden that they would reduce their prices by way of value engineering once in the contract, and that understanding would be entered into or arrived at perhaps prior even to the award of the contract?
It was my understanding that the conversation would not make any reference to their position in terms of the tender, that it was purely trying to seek an understanding that they were accepting of the process that would be followed once an award had been made if they were successful.
You go on to say in your email that some savings, it says the penultimate line, have already been identified and the contractor may well put forward others for consideration during the discussions that can be investigated prior to entering into contract. Are you saying there that the TMO could ask Ryden to identify specific savings that they would make before they're awarded the contract?
No, it was reference to other savings that might be identified by other members of the professional team, not by the contractor.
All right, but in terms of timing, the timing is that Ryden would identify other savings for consideration, which could be discussed before the contract was awarded.
No, that's not what's being said there.
So what are you saying there?
The savings had already been identified. That there were savings some had been identified within Ryden's tender.
Yes.
Some had been identified by other members of the professional team.
Yeah.
And that there were still ongoing investigations in terms of looking at what other potential savings might be made by the professional team, and that once the contract had been awarded to whoever it might be awarded to, then further discussions might be entered into as to whether there were any actual further savings other than those that had already been identified.
Yeah, this is rather different, though, from what Jenny Jackson is saying, isn't it? Because she's saying that the TMO could let a bidder know that the TMO would like to do a valuation exercise when in contract, but not actually seeking savings before the contract.
Correct.
Yeah. But what you're suggesting is rather different from the Trower's advice, isn't it?
No, because Trowers are saying that you can if you enter into a contract at the value, then you can enter into a value engineering process once they are awarded.
Indeed, but what you're suggesting, I think, in your email, is that there could be this offline discussion with the preferred contractor prior to the contractor even being notified that it was preferred.
Purely to identify the process that would be followed. It wasn't to actually investigate any savings or any value engineering.
I see. So that's the distinction you would draw, is it?
Yes.
In other words, identifying a process rather than identifying any specific savings.
Correct.
I see.
And why not go through the same process with the other bidders?
We probably should have done, but the feeling was that they were so far away that there was no opportunity that there was no way that they were going to close that gap. And the TMO actually needed to be able to have comfort, otherwise they wouldn't be able to sign off the tender report, in which case then we wouldn't have had a project.
Because the nature of the comfort, if I've understood it correctly, is in effect to tell the preferred bidder that although the contract sum was 9.4 odd million, in reality there would have to be a reduction in different aspects of the work to bring it down within budget. That was the essential nature of what was being communicated, wasn't it?
Yes, there would be a process gone through to, so effectively it was managing the contractor's expectations that if they were awarded a contract at 9.24 million, that actually eventually the price that gets that would get signed off wouldn't be that value.
Yes.
Why didn't you, just to revisit the point the chairman's just put to you, why didn't you adopt the same exercise across a level playing field with all the tenderers to give them an equal opportunity to discuss the proposed approach, even if not figures, for value engineering?
Because we felt that the difference between the tenderers in terms of what had already been evaluated was such that there was only really one player in the process now.
Right. This is before even the interviews, as we can see. It's 4 days before the interviews. What was the point of having the interviews then, if you'd already made the decision that, as you put it, there was only really one player in the process?
Because the interviews had been identified as part of the ODU process, evaluation process, and therefore we couldn't just discount those. And they were part of the overall scoring mechanism to achieve an overall score. But even if Ryden had scored 0 and everyone else had scored 5, they still wouldn't have actually been in a better position. It wouldn't have changed the markings.
Indeed. And doesn't that rather tell us that, in fact, this exchange, whether or not it complies with the legal advice or corresponds with Trower's legal advice, shows us that actually the TMO had essentially selected Ryden purely on the basis of price, on the basis of the tenders as had come in. And it was for that reason that the value engineering discussions or approach to value engineering was not opened with any of the other tenderers.
No, because the overall evaluation criteria were based on price, quality and interview. So the price was 40%, the overall quality was 55% and the interview was 5%. So actually the emphasis was on quality, not on price.
Let me put it a different way. Whatever had led to the conclusion, you had already made your minds up by the 3rd of March that Ryden was going to win. which is why you didn't approach the other
When you
tenders.
say made our minds up, that was the outcome of the evaluation. It wasn't the fact that we just made our minds up. We had gone through a particularly detailed process of evaluation and scoring, which had resulted in all 3 tenders being scored, and Rydens was exceptional.
Yeah.
Had performed exceptionally well on both price and on quality relative to the other tenderers.
But as I said to you a moment ago, that process hadn't been completed yet, the scoring, because the interviews hadn't taken place.
Which represented 5%. And that gap wouldn't have been bridged even, as I say, Rydens had scored 0 and the other tenderers had scored 5.
Yeah.
So in actual fact, although we had to go through that process, because that's the OJU process and somebody could have challenged us if we hadn't have gone through that process, it was already a foregone conclusion.
I think that answers my question. Can we then go to the top of this email chain, ART 406433? And we can see there that, as I showed you before, Jenny Jackson says to David Gibson, we need to think how this would be presented to the board. Is it right that the TMO wanted to seek reductions from Rydens as the lowest tenderer, even in advance of entering into the contract?
It was expected that the value engineering would result in reductions in the contract award price.
And was that because the TMO wanted to reduce the price to fit their budget?
They wanted to reduce costs, yes.
To fit their budget?
Yes.
Or as close to as they could?
Yes, because they didn't have any way of increasing their budget.
Right. And by this advice, were you assuring the TMO, in what you were saying, that they could seek reductions in advance of the award of the contract, or at least seek clarity about the approach to reductions, if I can put it more delicately, in advance of the award of the contract?
We could say that the contractor had understood what the process would be, but we couldn't give any further clarity other than that, because there was no obligation or commitment from the contractor to actually have to comply with that.
Yes. So, in a nutshell, this email chain shows that even before the interviews, as it was forming part of the OJEU process, there were unilateral, or there were proposals for unilateral discussions with Rydens as one of the bidders about value engineering that were not made available to the other bidders.
About the process of value engineering, not about the detail of value engineering.
And if it was about the process and therefore completely above board as you might have it, why was it needed? Why did it have to be quotes unquotes informal or offline, as you put it?
Because the whole process of value engineering had been taken out of the tender report, and therefore it was going to become a post-award process.
Right. Do you feel entirely comfortable about this way of proceeding, Mr. Cash?
No, but this was a process of being able to get the TMO board to be able to sign off and get to a position where a contract could be awarded. As I say, otherwise there wouldn't have been a contract award and there wouldn't have been a project.
Does that tell us that Artelia was prepared to support the TMO in a course of action that the TMO wanted to take, even if Artelia wasn't entirely comfortable with it?
It was, I suppose, again, where we were being put under pressure by our client to try and follow a process.
Yes. Yes. Now let's move forward a little bit in time. As I understand it, chronologically, the events are on the 7th of March, the interviews take place, and on the 10th of March, Claire Williams produces a report recommending Rydens as the winner. Do you remember that? Have I got those dates?
I think those are correct, yes.
Yes. And on the 12th of March, I think it's right that Artelia produced a final tender report, also recommending Rydens as the winner. And I can give a reference for that. That's ART 402197. There's no need to turn it up. And then on the 18th of March, just following the chronology, putting it in context, notices were sent by Artelia to all bidders, letting them know the outcome. Does that accord with your recollection?
Yes.
And the one that went to Rydens is at ART 408632. I just want to have a look, having given you the framework of the dates, 7th of March to 18th of March 2014, what happened in detail in that period. Now, Mr. Chairman, this is a reasonably lengthy topic, but we can make some progress in 5 minutes. I'd quite like to start on it if we can.
All right, yes, well, we can do that.
I could probably get down to the next subtopic in 5 minutes. Can I ask you to go, please, to RYD 303310? This is an email chain between the TMO and Ryden on the 13th and 14th of March 2014. And can we look, please, first at the email from David Gibson of the TMO to Steve Blake of Ryden at the very bottom of the first page, page 1, and then over onto page 2. The bottom of page 1, these things get cut off sometimes, but the bottom of page 1 shows that this is an email from David Gibson to Steve Blake, 13th of March 2014. And if we go to the top of page 2, we can see the substance of it. Let's look at the first 3 paragraphs. He says, Steve, Peter Madison of the TMO has given me your contact details. I understand you are currently in a meeting. I have attached a simple spreadsheet indicating the areas we would like you to look at in relation to possible savings. Our target is around £800,000, which included the cladding savings already priced and any grant income to the scheme. Were you aware of this email at the time, do you think?
No.
You weren't. Were you aware at the time that Ryden was asked by the TMO to find savings of £800,000?
No.
And therefore, it would follow that you weren't aware that the TMO had asked Ryden to find savings of £800,000 even before Ryden had been notified that they were the successful bidder.
Correct.
But does that surprise you?
It does.
Why does it surprise you?
Because I wasn't aware that this was happening.
Well, that goes without saying. That's how most surprises happen. But does it shock you?
Well, yes, because I wouldn't expect that of an organisation of the TMO.
No. If we can go up to page 1, we can see that the parties agreed to meet the following Tuesday, which is as it turns out, the 18th of March 2014. There's an error about Monday and Tuesday. Now, that meeting was in the period during which the OJEU process was still running, wasn't it?
Yes.
Because, in fact, although the letter went out on the 18th of March 2014, it went out late in the day on that day. Were you, or to your knowledge, anybody else at Artelia, aware that on the 18th of March 2014, before the notification of the result, TMO and Ryden had a meeting to discuss savings to be made, including savings on cladding?
No.
And again, are you surprised in the sense of shocked to discover that had happened?
Yes.
I assume, from what you just told us, that there was no one from Artelia at the meeting.
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Can I also assume that you've never seen any notes of that meeting?
No. We've
asked those who have attended whether they took any notes, and we've not seen any. Can we then go to ART 408755? This is the email from Philip Booth sending out Ryden's notification that it was the preferred bidder. You can see that, 18th of March 2014, and it's sent at 5 to 6 in the evening, 5:55. Do you see that?
Yes.
Dear Peter, and it goes to Ryden, Peter Arnold at Ryden. Dear Peter, please find attached the notice of tender result for the works at Grenfell Tower. And it appears to be sent out, as far as we've been able to piece together the timing, after the meeting between the TMO and Ryden about value engineering on that day. Do you know how Artelia knew to send out the notices? Was there a final instruction from the TMO to press the button and send it out?
I would expect there would have been, because once our tender report gets submitted, it gets reviewed, and I believe that it had to be presented to the TMO board for them to sign off and approve the appointment of the contractor.
Yes. Do you know when that happened?
I can't remember for sure, no. But I believe it would have happened prior to us issuing those. We wouldn't have issued them without some reference from the TMO.
No, indeed. And do you have a feel for how soon before 5 to 6 on the 18th of March 2014 the instruction came from the TMO to send this letter out to the bidders?
I don't know.
You don't know. All right. Mr. Chairman, is that a convenient moment?
Yes, that suits you, does it?
It does.
Right, well, Mr. Cash, we're going to finish there for the day. I'm sorry I've got to ask you to come back and answer some more questions tomorrow, but I think you may have been warned that was likely to happen.
Yes, I have been.
So we'll resume at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Please don't talk to anyone about your evidence or anything to do with it overnight.
I won't.
And we'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow.
Right. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you very much. We'd like to give the usher.
Thank you.
Thank you. 10 o'clock tomorrow.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.